Hello everybody, my name is Ratnus, and today I wanted to make a video about the implications of the Covenant swapping that is coming in patch 9.1.5, and how it'll affect different specs and different classes differently. So I just want to talk about where there will be situations where some classes gain a big way to do something cool and new that they couldn't do before the system, which classes are going to be roughly the same, which specs are going to be ones where it'll be really valuable to go and level up another Covenant and, learn how to play it, versus which ones you'll see people just still sticking with just their one Covenant the whole way through, as if nothing had changed at all. So I'm going to talk about both Raid and Mythic Plus. I'm going to use this nifty Wowhead Best Covenant guide just as... I'm not just going to... this is just going to help me keep on track with where all the specs are and what the conventional wisdom best covenants are for certain ones. But yeah, disclaimer, this isn't going to cover PvP. A big advantage, of course, of this system is that you can switch to a PvP covenant and back, but I don't know enough about which covenants those are for which specs and how important they are to really give you an idea of how much value certain specs got out of that versus others. So this is going to be fully PvE focused. So let's start off with the tanks here. Blood Death Knights. Generally, these were playing Venthyr in Mythic Plus. For Raid, usually you saw them being Necrolord because of the utility of grippy hands on a lot of boss fights. So for Raid progression, that was really valuable on fights like Soul Render. I actually think Blood gains quite a bit out of the ability to swap freely in a progression Raid environment. If you think about this tier, Necrolord was really good for... just if you were playing a Blood Death Knight, you were probably a Necrolord so that you could have the grippy hands on fights like Soul Render. That was the most value you could get out of your Covenant in the Raid. But being able to freely swap, say if that had been in place for Sanctum, you could have played Night Fae for fights like Painsmith, where you wanted to jump over the spikes, and where you needed to move quickly to put your tank mechanic in the right spot. In fact, a lot of people who were in World First progression swapped off of their Blood Death Knights due to a lack of mobility for handling that mechanic as well. And also, on a fight like, say, Sylvanas, I imagine there's a good chance that, the Necrolord is something you would consider dropping for either Venthyr or maybe Fae as well. There are a couple spots there as a tank where being slow in Phase 3, for instance, is a bit of a pain. Being able to blink is nice. Although, the Fleshcraft Shield's pretty strong too. It would have been a tough decision for sure. And then I guess Kyrian is even an option you could have considered for some raid fights as well. So yeah, definitely something that I think Blood Death Knights will be pretty happy with that change. In Mythic Plus, then yeah, you can play I think you'll mostly see probably Venthyr or Necrolord for dungeons where you get a lot of value out of, mass gripping everything in on a lot of pulls. Vengeance Demon Hunter, the big thing for Vengeance Demon Hunter, so Kyrian is a really good spec, a really good covenant for Vengeance in all forms of content. It'll be nice to be able to swap to Fae to play Havoc for stuff, but mostly I think you'd be pretty happy just having Kyrian leveled if you were a Vengeance main. You can use Night Fae on some fights, like on Pure Single Target. It's a pretty good option, but I think this is one that'll be relatively minimally impacted. Guardian Druid, actually, so there's a lot of different stuff you can do with Guardian with all four of the Covenants. It's listed here as just Night Fae for Raid, but honestly, I've seen, I think, everything except for Necrolord doing cool and interesting stuff in Raid, and I think even Necrolord is a solid consideration as well. You can go for a damaging build, you can go for utility, you can go for survivability, and there's different ways to build that within each of the Covenants as well. Different ways, with different affinities as well. Trying to do a big Convoke is something that does a lot for damage in some spots, although for consistent damage, especially if you have to stay bear form, stuff like Venthyr, really good for that also. So yeah, I think this is going to be a good change for Guardian for sure. I think you definitely, in Mythic Plus as well, being able to swap around between these. I imagine that high-end Guardian Druid key pushers will probably see a lot of play on all four of them, and this is definitely one of the specs that, if your group needs a Necrolord because you're going to do a Necrolord dungeon, the Guardian can absolutely fill that role. Kyrian Guardian also really good for, if you play the Bond Empowering Legendary in Raid to make somebody else do more damage. Although there are a lot of cool legendary options just for Guardians for themselves that they want to play as well. Brewmaster, Kyrian, a really good option for Brewmaster in all forms of content. Although you can play Necrolord, and you can also play Fae, I think, in Mythic Plus in some spots. For, you know, it is something that I've seen a little bit of use there. So I think this is going to be a spec where, like, if you want to experiment with more stuff, you can. But sort of like Vengeance, you know, you would be pretty happy just being Kyrian for all of time and not really changing too much. So minimally impacted, I would say. Prop Pally, I think the biggest change is that you'll be able to swap between Venthyr and Kyrian based on whether you want to do keys or M+. Venthyr is so good for a raid. It just does so much damage that it's hard to imagine playing anything else. And then Kyrian's really good in M+. There's a lot of control. You can play Venthyr as well in M+, for like boss damage, but it's a very clunky Mythic Plus Covenant, whereas Kyrian is kind of the opposite. So yeah, that's the main benefit that Prop Pallies are getting out of this. And then finally, Prop Warrior. They have these three Covenants listed here, and honestly, Venthyr for single target damage, also not a bad option either. So this is going to be pretty useful for Prop Warriors, swapping between raid and M+, and swapping even from boss fight to boss fight. Kyrian Spear on a nice short cooldown. There's some spots where it provides really useful utility with its grips as well. Kyrian and Night Fae, though, pretty similar effects, right? AoE damage cooldown. Although different soulbind trees that have interesting different effects for Warrior depending on what you want. And of course, any tank being able to swap to Kyrian for a fight where you want Phial of Serenity. That's something I haven't mentioned yet, but is really valuable also just for necrotic weeks. Always something to consider as well. And being able to play Necrolord to buff your team, really valuable if that's being used well. So absolutely something to look out for. I think Prot Warriors... Prot Warriors is a spec where you could be pretty comfortable just maining one of these and only playing it, and that'll be fine for you, because they all were pretty close, and people did just play whatever, and it was fine. But the people that do want to actually mess around and use different ones, this is going to be a spec where you actually will get to do that in a way that, like, you know, maybe Brew and Vengeance, it's like, you can try and experiment, but there's a more clear, probably right answer, I think. Okay, Healer Covenants. This is an area where I have the least expertise, so I will disclaim this section accordingly, but it is worth noting that a lot of the healers had a lot of optionality. When you're looking at Mythic Plus in particular, that is something where the M+, you know, dungeon-specific buff, often that job is going to fall to your healer to swap to the Covenant of doing that in a high-end group. In a low-end group, of course, you know, if you don't expect people to swap Covenants, and don't accept people expecting you to do that if you don't want to. But I think that will be a common play pattern among high-end groups, is that, like, if you're in a group where you don't have a Necrolord or a Venthyr, you know, your healer will swap to those based on when you go to those dungeons. That's definitely an option. I think in high-end groups, Holy Paladins in both raids and M+, basically always played Venthyr, just so much damage. Kyrian is a really nice option, though, for easier gameplay, for lower-end groups, for groups that aren't going to optimize the Venthyr as much, and for just consistent, easier class. A lot more fun as well. A lot of Holy Paladins have a lot more fun on Kyrian also, so that'll be nice. They get to kind of swap between those rather than having to commit to one or the other. Mistweaver. Interesting they don't list Venthyr here, when Venthyr Mistweaver is actually a huge... So that's been a fairly recent discovery as a huge throughput monster under the right circumstances for Mistweaver. But yeah, absolutely something that's flexible and can swap to a lot of different options. They have Fae listed here for Resto. Assuming that Fae Resto doesn't get nerfed, I think you'd be pretty happy just playing that in most cases. Necrolord is not an impossible option for a little bit more precision and consistency. But the strength of Resto Convokes is really high, so as long as it keeps doing what it's doing, I think that's a safe bet. Kyrian Disc has been really big as well this patch, and likely will continue to be. For Holy, Night Fae is what is listed here, although I think Kyrian is a really good option for Holy Priest as well, and yeah, I suspect that there's, again, the ability to swap to just whatever your group needs. In M+ is going to be a big thing. And Resto Shaman can absolutely play any of them in M+ very easily. The Kyrian build has been doing a huge amount of AoE damage. In Raid, you'll usually see that like the Necrolord is kind of the default option, although this tier it would have been really nice to be able to swap to Venthyr or Night Fae on, say, Painsmith to jump over that spike wall, because otherwise Resto Shaman had really big difficulty with that. Same with Priest, actually, being able to get that, the ability to swap for low cost to a movement covenant is actually, I think, going to be a pretty big tiebreaker if they make fights like that going forward. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. And if you're interested in doing mythic progression, even if you're like, I probably would never use, this covenant on its merits, think about leveling up just for Soul Shape, just for if you want Soul Shape on a fight, because I think that could be a valuable play to make for your raid. Okay, melee DPS here. So DPS Death Knights, usually you've just seen DPS Death Knights kind of staying Necrolord, because that's been a good Jack of all trades option, and in raid in particular, the option to have the grippy hands. On the fights where there's Death Knight utility that's good, it's usually the grips, and so the Covenant that enhances that makes sense with sort of the default. But with this swapping, I actually think there's quite a bit of options that are gained here, depending on the number of targets, and depending on which of the builds you're playing at these specs. So I would say DPS Death Knights are definitely a winner here, and also one of the specs that benefits from being able to swap to a mobility covenant. This is one of the classic slow specs that could use a blink. So definitely worth looking out for. Havoc's pretty happy just playing Fae everywhere. You can, there's been attempts to make stuff like Venthyr good, and I think that it could be fun messing around with. But this is one of those specs that you were very happy just playing Fae 24/7. Being able to swap, though, to tank as Kyrian will be a nice quality of life increase if that's something you're into. Feral Druid. Currently, Feral Druid Fae is really, really strong. You play the Night Fae Legendary, you still get all your stacks of Naya when you press Convoke, and it's a really potent build for damage in raid. And it's not that it's like a sick Mythic Plus Covenant so much as there isn't really a sick Mythic Plus Covenant for Feral. AoE is definitely something that the spec needs some attention in that department, so hopefully they give them that attention, and that attention could be in the form of looking at one of the other covenants, and that, if that happened, then it would be nice to be able to swap, but as of right now, you're pretty happy just playing Fae all day. Serve Hunter, Year of the Sphere. Okay, so Kyrian, really nice in AoE for survival, because you just get 40-second Resonating Arrow, and that lines up really nicely with just huge bursts of bomb damage, and it can be really good for AoE damage with that setup as it stands. In raid, Kyrian's a good option. It'll be nice, I think, to be able to swap to, say, Fae as well, particularly like on a pure single target fight where you want the cooldown timings of that. But I think that, this is another one where I guess serve mains as well. It's more that like hunters, mess around with survival as well from time to time. So if you're like a MM or BM main, it'll be nice as well to be able to swap the covenants and then also go play some Kyrian serve. Although Kyrian works for those specs too. Windwalker you've traditionally seen as Necrolord this patch, although last patch they were primarily Kyrian. Necrolord is really, really, really good for Windwalker in all content right now. If you wanted to fight on a pure single target encounter, you could probably get a little bit more out of Kyrian on average, and so that's a swap that you could make. I don't think anybody will make that for farm this tier, but having access to that for progression next tier, definitely a good option. Very safe with the way that balancing currently exists to just play Necrolord and basically everything, though. Ret Pally. The nice thing about Ret Pally is you can swap Venthyr for if you need it on a certain fight. Like on progression rating, Kyrian is a really good option, but sometimes getting something like an Ashen Hallow, the strength of that cooldown, is worth the slight DPS loss to do so. And so being able to do that on a fight where it was called for, a fight like Guardian of the First Ones, perhaps, that fight wasn't hard enough to justify it, and maybe if it was hard enough, the DPS check would be high enough that you couldn't do it. But getting an extra cooldown like that, another spec as well, where going a Covenant that gives you a blink will be a nice little piece of flexibility. One of the specs that really is missing the ability to, cover a large distance quickly without having to just walk or move speed increase their way. All right, let's talk a little bit about rogues. Rogues have a lot of good Covenant choices. You can see everything except for Fae being represented here. There was a time where people were messing around with Fae, but it hasn't been too much this patch. It's kind of fallen off for all 3 specs as being something that really gets considered. Although you do see it from time to time, because all the Covenants are so close for Rogue. They're all pretty low impact. The way it mostly works out, you'll see like Outlaws generally playing Necrolord, Assassination Rogues, and Subtlety Rogues generally playing Venthyr, and like PvP Rogues are playing Kyrian, has been how I've mostly seen it. And it'll be really nice to be able to just swap around in between those, and within each spec as well, depending on whether you're in an M+, like Outlaw M+, Necrolord is pretty dominant, but being able to swap, the others are... It's dominant in terms of a lot of people are playing it. It's not dominant in terms of like, oh, it's many percent ahead in DPS. It's like, it's all pretty small potatoes for Rogue. So being able to swap for like a dungeon buff, being able to swap for some weird soulbind you want or some specific fight, it's definitely going to be nice. Enhanced Shaman. You're usually seeing Enhancement Shaman. They've sort of coalesced around Fae in Raid. Although being able to swap to like an AoE Covenant like Venthyr definitely will be a nice option as well. So that'll be some pretty good effect for that spec. Warriors, Fury Warrior, Venthyr, and Raid. Definitely going to be nice to be able to swap to that for, depending on what balancing looks like next tier. If Arms gets some of the nerfs that are sort of being expected to come its way, that'll be a nice way to specialize. As it stands right now, it's like Venthyr Fury single target isn't even necessarily better than Arms, which it should be. Although, even if it isn't, being able to spec into that for a fight where condemn windows are at the important times in the boss's health will be pretty valuable. And then being able to play, Fae is really good for Arms all around. Kyrian is actually a really nice Covenant for Arms M+. And then being able to swap to Necrolord, it's not something that Warriors are going to be delighted by the prospect of, but I do think there will be some options where swapping to Necrolord can get you some value, maybe in Mythic progression. It'll be an interesting thing to consider, but I guess it's maybe 50-50 whether that's actually ever good to do. And definitely something that Warriors will grumble about if it is ever worth doing. Okay, Balanced Druid. Being able to swap between Fae and Venthyr for Raid is going to be really nice. That was a big point of discussion, point of debate that came out this tier was, is Night Fae or Venthyr the way to go on my Balanced Druid? And next year, the answer is going to be, hey, you can swap between these, right? Do you want the more impressive damage, more impressive burst of the Venthyr in exchange for the longer cooldown timings, the losing the ability to do small convokes, which Fae didn't really do anyways in ideal circumstances, and, losing the ease of play, Night Fae just having one button that you can press, move while casting, and it lasts for 4 seconds, versus Venthyr, where it's like, okay, for the next 40 seconds, I need to not get any mechanics or have anything bad happen to me or have anybody, choose me for anything to do. Ideally, all that. I mean, obviously, Venthyr players could outplay that kind of stuff, but you could look at there were strategies that were like built around Venthyr Moonkins, and that was a big strength of the Covenant, and you'll continue to see that done. But the option to swap into something like Fae when you don't want to pay that price will be big. And it'll be nice as well for just a more like early progression. I think this is something where even like midway through progression, you could see Druids, as they become comfortable with the fight, swapping off of Fae and into Venthyr for that fight. And that could be a cool way to minimize those first 50 pulls with a Venthyr Druid where they're just dead every pull. M+, Venthyr has come way ahead of Fae just because Fae is not a Covenant that really adds anything to AoE, and Venthyr actually does. And so that is something that I suspect will continue. Although in lower keys, Fae is totally a good option, but as you start getting to high keys, where things are actually living long enough to eat a Ravenous Frenzy, then Venthyr can start to be really good if it's played well. Fae is a lot easier to use, though. If you're doing low keys, I think you probably will get more mileage out of that. Hunter. Okay, so Hunter, we talked a little bit about Serve already, generally wanting to be Kyrian. Night Fae is sort of a more standard, traditional option for Hunters. There was also that bit of the Venthyr, some would describe it as maybe a meme, that never really materialized this tier for single target, but, maybe it could if the swap could be done on a per-fight basis. That'll be interesting to keep track of. I think the big thing is being able to swap from a 2-minute choice to a 1-minute / potentially even 40-second cooldown choice is a pretty big piece of flexibility that will add a lot of value to, whenever next tier's progression comes around. If your hunter's able to do that and able to have both of those covenants ready, that will be good for whichever of those cooldown timings you want. Mage is a pretty big winner from this in terms of quality of life. It's actually a relatively small winner in terms of, like, if you just locked yourself into playing Fae, you could play all 3 covenants and all forms of content reasonably well, but it'll be really nice to get access to Kyrian Arcane. It'll be nice to get access to Venthyr Frost for single target. It'll be nice to, just be able to experiment with all these things. Even, Necrolord Arcane has a niche where it is the best. It's just a very rare niche for that to show up, so you would never choose that as your covenant. But, now that the swap is free, maybe something to do. Shadow Priest has traditionally been Fae, although once you got your full Necrolord tree and you got that bottom-most trait unlocked, Necrolord ended up pulling like 500 DPS ahead or something. This is another spec where it'll be really nice to, you could play the Necrolord for damage and for fights where that's good, and then you could play Fae for utility and for movement on fights where you want that, rather than having to, be pulled in both those directions and make an awkward choice and then do the swap in a really painful fashion after you kill one boss before you get to the next hard boss. It'll be really nice to just be able to do that at a whim during progression as you get to each boss. Ellie Shaman. Ellie Shaman are another one where, so both Necrolord and Fae are really good, and sort of similar to Shadow Priest. Being able to swap on a per fight basis will be nice as well. Necrolord is a lot more nice in the spec, like it plays a lot better, but Fae probably is a little better for, for raid. So it's tough. I mean, it's a really minor difference to the two. You could absolutely play an Ellie Shaman as either one and not level up the other and be fine. The option to switch, though, will certainly be nice. And finally, we get to Warlock. Warlock is probably the spec that cares the least about free Covenant swaps. You're very happy just playing Night Fae in all content for all time. Even the Conduit energy change isn't a big deal for Warlock, because you could basically just put one spec into each of the soulbinds and be pretty happy. It'll be nice to be able to swap a little bit between the trees and play all 3 trees as all 3 specs, but really Warlock not caring too much about this. They're happy just playing Fae everywhere. In theory, there is Necrolord Demonology, pure single target potentially as an option. Also in theory, there's the Venthyr Warlock legendary that they've buffed twice and is maybe good AoE under the right circumstances, or I don't know. I mean, it's all so hard to imagine actually wanting to do something other than playing Night Fae, but if you're a Warlock and you want to mess around with some other covenants, I guess that'll be nice. It'll be kind of fun to do, but yeah, as it stands right now, this is probably the class that cares the least about any of this. Okay, so there's a little bit of a overview of what's coming for different specs and different classes in patch 9.1.5. I hope to not have scared anyone into thinking they're going to be obligated to grind up multiple covenants. For almost all cases, you're going to be just fine. Especially if you were somebody who was just fine playing whatever covenant you were playing in last patch, that is almost certainly going to continue going forward, unless you're in some guild that takes this opportunity to go from not enforcing covenant choices to enforcing covenant choices in the next patch, which I don't think is gonna be very many guilds that meet in the middle of that Venn diagram, but maybe it'll happen. For the most part, I think if you've got one choice that you liked, one covenant that you liked, that will continue to be a perfectly viable way to play. But for players that did want to get access to, their preferred options, to be able to experiment, all of those sorts of things, there's a lot of possibilities that this opens up, and I think a lot of possibilities that it's kind of hard to even really think about, like the thinking about swapping to Night Fae for one boss for Soul Shape. Those sorts of things are going to be really, for me personally, really exciting to consider during progression next year, and I hope to be able to come up with some cool ways to do different things using some lesser known covenants that you really didn't have the option when it was a full swap to it and then a full swap back if you didn't like it. Anyways, that is that look. Hope you enjoyed this. Yeah, Thanks for watching. Come check out my Twitch stream. See you in the next one. Bye.